What you heard out of Russia in Ukraine today, can that be taken at face value?
Well, I think it's promising that when diplomats meet, rather than, they kill each other and on the front lines. However, I think we cannot be complacent of the first, however promising, signs of diplomatic talks. It's going to be a long path of very uneven and bumpy road, and it will depend very much on what President Putin has in mind and what his final goals at this stage.
Vygaudas, the lie of the land seems to be that Vladimir Putin is, as Roz was just saying, focusing on the east and the south. He maybe is going to look to control the Donbass region and other regions on a long-term basis. He would then find himself with a neutral Ukraine that may be part of the EU. Is that, do you think, the most likely scenario that we are heading towards here?
Well, I don't think whether President Putin has changed his political goals because he still considers himself as on the messianic task to rescue so-called Slavic world from the evil West. Having embarked upon a brutal, unprovoked war in Ukraine, he has confronted with a strong resilience and military capacity of Ukraine to defend its own territory. And I think these past months have shown that Ukrainians are capable to do, and the West will provide any support feasible and possible. So it may force him to reconsider his own the end game, and instead of what initially was perceived as his ultimate goal for the regime change to take over the entire territory. Hopefully he had reduced his ambitions, and the talks which have been taking place in Istanbul will open the door for a more profound and direct talks between President Zelensky and Vladimir Putin.
If Vladimir Putin is reconsidering and perhaps in some ways blinking here as he looks to reformulate his strategy, I'm wondering what role the West then needs to play in a crisis that it maybe is de-escalating. You had previously argued that sanctions weren't enough, that use of force had to be on the table. That is the only thing that Vladimir Putin would respond to. If he already is responding in this way, is that something that you still think would be necessary?
Well, let's be very honest. If not the willingness and capacity of Ukrainians to fight for their own freedom and for our freedom, for European freedom, for American freedom, Putin would have gone with his, bold and crazy ideas to march across the entire continent. And that's why I still believe that the strongest sign the West can provide, and not only to encourage politically and verbally, but to provide military ammunition to Ukrainians to defend themselves, to get NATO and American troops on the ground in the Baltics and Poland, as President Biden has demonstrated. And that's a force which will force Putin to reconsider alongside the sanctions. I think it was quite remarkable to see that Roman Abramovich was participating in the meetings in Istanbul. It means it hurts even the richest oligarchs in Russia, who may play a constructive role at the end of the day.
Let's talk a little bit about what would happen were a peace deal to be agreed. What is the trajectory of sanctions in that kind of scenario? Would we have to see regime change in Russia for sanctions to be downgraded? How would the sanctions story develop, do you think?
Well, it's a very good question. The purpose of the sanctions, when I was the EU ambassador to Russia in Moscow in 2014, when we coordinated with the United States ambassador in Moscow and among EU member states, the philosophy of sanctions is to influence the decision-making, more importantly, the behavior of Russian leadership. I must confess that the sanctions which were imposed up till now did not achieve that goal, as we see what is happening in Ukraine. Having said this, However, we also see a new dynamics. As I said, the sanctions have never been so comprehensively and so deeply and profoundly applied to the Russian economy and to the Russian leadership and to Russian business elite. And that's why, alongside with the military might of Ukrainians, with strong support of NATO, that may deter Putin and to reconsider its own views. What will be the peace deal? It's still far too early to say. I think it's going to be a long process, which will take not days, months, and weeks, but probably months, several months, if not, an entire year, as it really, will represent a set of very difficult questions, which especially Ukrainians have to respond. What's going to be the fate and status of Donbass, Donetsk, and Luhansk region? What's going to be the status of Crimea? And what's going to be the status in terms of Ukrainian aspirations? At the end of the day, that's what revolution was all about in 2013 and 14, to honor aspirations of Ukrainians to be part of European Union and NATO.